Teal's work. I've been following her amazing,
That's your arrow right there.
thank you, her amazing TikToks that really point sharply at the issues we have in water in the West. So thank you for your unflinching speaking about those issues. Okay, let's try again, shall we? Okay, yay. Okay, so I begin this talk with a land acknowledgement that where we are here in Avon is the ancestral and present lands of the Nuchiu or Ute people. So here's the overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll first give you a bit of history about myself and about the Four Corners region that this history is focused on, to give you the context that this talk is coming from. I will then discuss Indigenous people of the American West briefly, and then focus us in onto the Ute people of Colorado, Utah, and the surrounding region. Once I've discussed pre-colonial times, I will then discuss the conquest of Colorado by first the Spanish, and then the United States. And then I will finish this talk by discussing Indigenous sovereignty today, with a focus on Ute water rights. So I grew up in Mancos, Colorado, located right here in the Four Corners region. And this is a great map to kind of show you the landscape that my research is focused on and where I grew up. So here is the, oops, wrong button. Here's the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, the Southern Ute Reservation, Mesa Verde National Park, and the other three corners of the Four Corners are made up by the Navajo Reservation. So the Four Corners are part of the largest swatch of reservation land in the United States. So this is the context that I grew up in. And my ancestry comes from those who conquered and those who were conquered. On my father's side, I have Belgian and Luxembourgian ancestry. On my mother's side, I have Spanish, Nigerian, and Yaqui ancestry from West Central Mexico. So my ancestry and my cultural heritage was mixed by conquest and hails from about 3 continents at least. And so I began this research in this region on the Dolores River, located here, and on the Dolores Project, which built McPhee Dam right about here, and diverts water from the Dolores River into this surrounding region. And it turns out that Ute Mountain Ute Reservation water rights were really critical to the construction of the Dolores Project, and for that project being fully funded and completed. And I never learned about Ute history growing up in Mancos from my school or from my community. And if I grew up right next to the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation in Mancos and never learned this history, I conclude that most Coloradoans have never learned this history. And so that's why I'm sharing this talk with you today. So in this talk, I name harsh actions which have taken place in the history of Colorado and in the creation of the United States. If educators before us took the time to incorporate conquest history into our Colorado history, we would be more at ease in discussing the topic of coercion. Coercion is a means of controlling the conduct of others through a threat to harm. Coercion exists in every society and in every part of the world. It exists in our families, in our marketplaces, and characteristically in political situations. Conquest, let me look at my notes real quick. I want to make sure the statement is very clear for everybody. So many people are understandably apprehensive to talk about the questionable and troublesome consequences to Indigenous people in the United States. And it's normal to go through a period of discomfort and adjustment when learning about this type of history. Compassion, blame and guilt are not helpful. Compassion and understanding are necessary as we learn this history. Awesome. Okay, so here is a map of the Indigenous people that were present in the West in 1860. You can see the number and diversity of people that were present in this landscape, and conquest was already well underway at this point. So you can see in California, a lot of tribes have been wiped out by Spanish conquest first, and then by the gold rushes in the 1840s and 1850s. And in Oklahoma, you can see that not only the Cherokee tribe had taken a trail of tears to this region, but also a lot of other eastern tribes as well. And in Colorado, you can see the Ute were pretty dominant in this region, as well as the Cheyenne and Arapaho, the Apache, the Pueblo, and the Navajo. And I want to show you, oh, I forgot about this, so I need to click on that link, Native Land Digital. Can you help me with that? To click on the link on this page. So this link right here. Oh, if we can, is it okay if I run the computer real quick?
Yeah.
Okay. We forgot about this detail. Okay, so here's a different map. Oh, no internet? Okay. Maybe I can try to show you later on, but this other map, which I will share a link for at the end of the talk, it is a crowdsourced map of Indigenous lands all over the world. And it's a really useful tool to locate yourself within Indigenous lands. And it's a great way to have a pre-colonized perspective of the world as well. And that map would show you this kind of information, but with the boundaries of the territories of people and the overlap of those boundaries. It's very dynamic and just a very great way to kind of inform yourself on Indigenous lands in a different way. Oh, do we gotta go back to the slide? Sorry about that. We should have talked about that link before preparing for this talk. Okay. Yay, okay. So now that I've talked about just American West Indigenous folks, I'm gonna zoom us in to the Ute people of Colorado and Utah. So this is a map of the territory of the Ute people and their different bands and where they ranged. And I'm going to focus this in on the Ute people of Colorado, but I'll just point out that the bands in black, these three now live in these reservations in Colorado, the only two reservations in Colorado. And the bands in red have all been moved to the Uintah Reservation in Utah, which is the second largest reservation in the United States, second only to the Navajo Reservation. And so I'll focus on the Colorado Utes. So here's the Muwatch band that lived around Pikes Peak and the Arkansas River, the Capote band that lived around the Rio Grande and the San Luis Valley, the Weenooch or Weminuche band that lived in the San Juan River watershed, as well as the Dolores River watershed, the Tabewatch that lived around the Gunnison River watershed, the Parianuche that lived around the White River, and the Yamparika that lived around the Yampa River. So Utes live nomadically in the landscape in family bands, and so their bands would winter in these kind of regions in the lowlands, and they would travel into the high country in the summer. So their culture was based on movement through elevations at appropriate times around the year. And because they were a nomadic culture, they don't have a huge record of physical object in the landscape. Rather, their record in the landscape are the trails that they followed all over the Rocky Mountains. And those trails were the paths of least resistance through the mountains and became some of the major roadways that we drive today. And you can also see I put a star in the landscape to mark roughly where we are in Avon. And you can look for that star through a lot of the maps of the talk today to locate us in space. And now I just want to show you some images of Ute ancestors to give you a sense of what they look like. So these are all photos taken between 1860 and 1880. And so these are some of the folks that the United States interacted with during its land appropriation. So here we have Severo and Buckskin Charlie, who were Capote leaders. We have Chipita and Ure, who were a couple, and they were Tabewatch leaders. And Ignacio, who was a Weminuche leader. And here is a Ute mother with a child in a papoose, which was a way that the Ute people would transport and carry their babies. So this just gives you a brief overview of the Ute people, and now I'm going to move us to European and Ute interactions. So by 1600, the Spanish had moved north from what is present-day Mexico into present-day New Mexico, and violently conquered the Pueblo people in the name of God in the Spanish Inquisition. And through that process, they kind of brushed against the southern edges of Ute territory. And the Utes, because they were nomadic, and because the Spanish weren't particularly interested in trying to acquire more land to the north, the Utes were able to maintain sovereignty over their homelands during Spanish rule of this area. And the Spanish and Ute were allies and trading partners on and off for over 200 years. Through this relationship, the Utes acquired horses from the Spanish, were one of the first tribes to do so. And the horse became an important symbol of prowess in Ute culture and just an important focus of Ute culture. With the horse, the Utes were able to travel farther and faster and defend their homelands more effectively. So the Spanish didn't travel into Ute territory very much, but they did do a few expeditions into Ute lands with Ute guides with them. And the most well-known expedition of Spanish into Ute territory was that of Dominguez and Escalante. And they traveled in the western slope of Colorado and eastern Utah. And this was some of the first documented European documentation of the Utahs, or Ute people. And Utah is named for the Ute people, much like many United States that are named after tribes, such as Iowa and Mississippi. So, so in 1821, Mexico gained independence from Spain, and so that whole landscape turned into Mexico. And then Texas, you can see, separated off of Mexico not long before it was annexed into the United States in 1845. Then in 1848, Mexico gave up another huge chunk of land in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War. So all of these land transitions by 1853 led the United States to have similar borders as we know them today around the outside edges. So basically 1853, the lower United States looked more or less like it does today. And all of these transitions of land, you can see there was this big crossroads going on in Colorado. And as well, all these European transitions of power happened with the resistance of Indigenous people whose lives were upended. So Colorado, or the region that is Colorado today, was not considered desirable territory at first because people were traveling around it and through it to get to California during the gold rushes. But all of this changed in 1859 when gold was discovered on the Platte River in what was then Denver City. And so many settlers rushed into these lands so swiftly that within 2 years, Colorado Territory was established. And through this push for land, the Arapaho people who lived along the Front Range and in the Eastern Plains were removed from their land since time immemorial in 4 years' time and moved to Oklahoma Territory. That same effort at removal was then aimed at the Ute people, which took about 4 decades rather than 4 years. And Indian killing and removal followed a similar pattern across US conquest. So first you'd have settlers that would arrive on indigenous lands looking for land that they could occupy, looking for mining lodes. And so then indigenous people and the settlers would come into conflict over competition over resources, basically. So then the United States would try to ameliorate that conflict by confining indigenous people to a bounded land area with a treaty. I'm sorry, this fly is just like hanging out with me. With a treaty that would so would use the treaty to confine the people to a bounded land area and then promise that there would be no white intrusion into those lands. But inevitably, settlers would enter into those lands, increasing conflict once again, and the tribes would try to ask the United States to uphold its end of the deal, but the United States would renegotiate another treaty to basically appropriate more lands. And the Ute experience exemplifies this pattern. So the first ratified treaty between the United States and the Utes was the Tabawatch Treaty of 1863. And this treaty was essentially trying to remove Utes from the San Luis Valley to open it to settlement. And really only one band agreed to this treaty, the Tabawatch Band. And so really this treaty didn't actually have much clout because each band of Utes had its own leadership that it elected itself, and there wasn't some unified leadership across all the bands. So without all the bands agreeing, this treaty basically was never upheld. But you can see that they tried to move the Utes to this little reservation and tried to cede all of this land to the United States. The second major treaty was the 1868 Kit Carson Treaty, which established a 16 million acre Confederated Ute Reservation, which essentially made up the western third of Colorado. Wrong thing, okay, sorry. So this whole area here. And this treaty was agreed to by 5 of the 6 Colorado bands of Utes, so it had a bit more clout to it. And it was during this treaty that the United States basically chose Ouray to be chief of all the Utes, which, as I said, went against their culture of having individual bands having their own leadership. But the United States chose Ouray to be representative of all the Utes because he spoke English, Spanish, Ute, and Apache, and he got along well with the settlers. So they saw him as a leader that was noble and trying to keep the peace. But many bands of Ute saw him as someone who's being bribed and manipulated into basically giving away their lands without consent. And of course, the United States didn't really uphold its end of the bargain over and over. So the Kit Carson Treaty was only upheld for about 2 years before gold was discovered just north of Durango in the Animas River watershed. And so the Utes tried to ask the United States to uphold its end of the deal and protect and keep those lands safe for the Utes instead of anybody else. But the United States negotiated a new treaty instead, called the 1874 Bruno Agreement. And this effectively eliminated, sorry, let's see. I keep getting the buttons wrong. Okay, this effectively eliminated 25% of the reservation from 25% of that reservation. So it basically separated this little southern strip of land from the whole northern portion of the reservation. And the Colorado settlers, were working to try to have the Utes removed entirely from Colorado. And it would take violence at the White River Agency in the northern portion of the reservation for that to happen. So in 1879, Nathan Meeker was an agent at the White River Agency. And agencies were established by the US government to develop relationships with tribes, to enforce treaties, and to distribute goods and food to tribes that were no longer allowed to basically provide for themselves. And Meeker, representing the Puritan and agricultural focus of his time, was bent on turning the Utes, the nomadic Utes, into sedentary farmers. And he went so far as to till up tracts of land that the Utes used to graze their horses to try to force them to farm. And according to Meeker's accounts, a leader of the Utes in the north, so it was the Padianuch and the Yamparika up north, right? So he was representing those tribes up there. So one of those leaders physically shoved him against his cabin and made him fear for his life. So he responded by calling the cavalry. He called a military force from Fort Fred Steele, about 200 miles north in Wyoming. So some of the Utes from that agency were outside the reservation and saw the cavalry coming. And they warned the commanding officer that if they crossed into Ute territory, which would be illegal to do, the US government cannot send military force into reservations legally. So the Utes warned them that if they crossed into their territory, they would defend themselves. So the cavalry arrived at Milk Creek, which was a border marker for the White River Agency, and a bunch of Ute warriors were waiting for them. So on both sides, they waved, they dismounted, and they began to approach each other, looking like they were going to talk peacefully, but then a shot rang out. I'm not sure from which side, but it resulted in a 5-day battle where the Utes pinned US forces, and there were major casualties on both sides. And US sent backup before the Utes surrendered. So Utes, the agency itself, when they found out about this battle at Milk Creek, they murdered all the white men at the agency and drove a stake through Meeker's mouth. Then they took all the women and children hostage. And PETA and Ouray actually negotiated with the Yamparika and the Padianuch to have the women and children returned safely. But this event fanned the flames of Colorado citizens that called for the government to make sure the Utes must go. So second governor of Colorado, Pitkin, answered that call from the Colorado settlers and basically designed a new treaty to effectively eliminate all of the Confederated Ute Reservation, save for that small strip on the New Mexico-Colorado border. So in that 5-year time between the Bruneau Agreement of 1874 and the massacre of 1879, a huge swatch of land opened up in the west for settlement. And in 1881, the town of Delta was established, so it was basically like a major land rush. And then 1882, Grand Junction, Hotchkiss, Paonia, and Montrose were all established. This was all on lands that had been legally Ute as little as 1 year prior. So the United States also appropriated Ute land in another way through the Dawes Severalty Act, which was basically designed to allocate 160 acres of plots of land to leaders or heads of Ute households. And in so doing, the action was to civilize Utes and confine them to smaller areas of land and make them farmers and ranchers, and thereby open more land for appropriation. And you can see the effect of the Dawes Act is really clear on the Southern Ute Reservation. So you can see the border of the reservation, the original border. Then you can see the lands in orange and green were allocated out or allotted out to the Ute people, and the remaining light-colored land was all opened up for settlement. So that creates that checkerboarded effect. So in 1895 when the Capote and the Muwatch agreed to land allotments and settled on the eastern portion of this strip of land and created the Southern Ute Reservation. But Ignacio, chief of the Weminuche Band, they refused to do allotments and moved to the western end of the reservation and owned all that land communally. So you can see that contrast of communal ownership and that checkerboarded ownership that happened from the Dawes Act. And this reservation is called the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation because of this Ute Mountain here, which is located right here on the reservation and looks like a person laying down. So now that I've gone through that story of land appropriation, I just want to show you this map once again to demonstrate how this was all predominantly Ute land, and today they all live on these reservations, which is a tiny fraction of their homelands. And every indigenous nation in the United States experienced land loss like this. So the effect of all this land appropriation is what indigenous scholar Dinah Helio-Whitaker calls an indigenous post-apocalyptic world. This is because indigenous people were removed from their lands in the forms of many trails of tears. They had experienced destruction of their lands and their livelihoods, experienced separation from and desecration of their sacred sites, and were forced to assimilate through military force and through military boarding schools. Despite all of this harm, indigenous people have persisted and have not given up fighting for their rights and for their cultures. The Ute Mountain Ute tribe fought for their rights in the 1988 Colorado Ute Water Rights Settlement Act. Say that 5 times fast. And so in 1895, when this reservation was established, the only major source of water was the Mancos River flowing through it. And according to the 1908 Winters Doctrine, every reservation comes with a water right dating to the time of that reservation's establishment. So the Ute Mountain Utes should have an 1895 right to the Mancos River. But upstream in the Mancos Valley here, settlers began to irrigate and divert water from the river, which dewatered the reservation. And in 1950, the Bureau of Reclamation built Jackson Gulch Reservoir, which further dewatered the Mancos River into the reservation. And all of this happened without consultation or involvement with the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, or the tribe. So this is a clear breach of their 1908 Winters Doctrine rights. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Ute Mountain Utes began to quantify their water rights and try to find a way to get water to their reservation, which has basically been dry. So they found that they could negotiate a settlement for their water rather than go through the courts. And during the 1980s, the Dolores Project, which includes McPhee Reservoir here, and which includes diversion infrastructure to all this agriculture in this area. So that project was already underway. So the Utes negotiated with Dolores project managers, with county administrators, with state agencies, federal agencies, and with environmental interests to try to get water to their reservation. And the crux of this negotiation was that the Utes agreed to subordinate their water right to the Mancos River, thereby protecting water rights in the Mancos Valley. And in exchange, they received a right to the Dolores Project to receive water and the funding for the infrastructure to deliver the water to the reservation. So basically, it was honoring reservation water rights that motivated the federal government to fully complete that project and to fully fund it. So you can see here from the Dolores Project, you have this long distance canal bringing water to this large scale irrigation. And you also have a treated water pipeline bringing water to the tribal headquarters at Toyac. And this is significant because the reservation had no running water for over 100 years. They had to truck in water to have any good quality water at all. So receiving good quality running water allowed the tribe to practice self-determination and develop economically in a way they had never been able to do before. This is also significant because the Utes became involved in management of their water on their reservation, when the norm in the Colorado Basin, the Colorado River Basin, is that tribes really have not had much, have been treated as an afterthought, basically, in terms of water planning and decision-making on the reservations. Here's how tribes are treated as an afterthought. So indigenous households are 19 times more likely to lack indoor plumbing, and 48% compared to white households. And 48% of indigenous households do not have reliable water at all. So lack of water infrastructure and lack of good quality water increases costs and time to acquire water, increases rates of infectious disease, and prevents economic development. This is a systemic problem for reservations in the entire United States, and even for people of color in general, such as Flint, Michigan, whose government has yet to address the poisonous water in that city, the poisonous water infrastructure there. I think there's one more point I wanted to make about this slide, just a moment. So within this context, it's really significant that the Ute Mountain Utes received a right to water and the funding to get that water to their reservation. And the Ute Mountain Utes are one of 30 federally recognized tribes in the Colorado River Basin, and those tribes collectively have a right to 25% of the Colorado River's flow. But lack of federal investment in infrastructure for reservations has prevented tribes from fully utilizing their water rights. And as we know, the Colorado River is drying out, so everybody that has a right to water is struggling even more to even get the water that they need. So with these conditions, it is super necessary and imperative that tribes be included in the decision making for Colorado River water management now and in the future. Importantly, the Colorado Water Conservation Board recently invited the Ute Mountain Utes and the Southern Utes to have a seat on that board and be involved in Colorado River management decision making. This demonstrates a shift in the relationship between the United States and tribes, where tribal sovereignty is being taken seriously rather than treated as secondary. At the national level, we're also seeing tribal sovereignty visible for the first time ever. So in 2020, President Biden appointed Deb Haaland as the first Secretary of the Interior, that's Indigenous, first Indigenous Secretary of the Interior ever. And Deb Haaland appointed Chuck Sams as the first Indigenous National Park Service Director in 2021. Then this year, Biden appointed Marilyn Malerba as the first Indigenous Treasurer. Her signature is now on US currency. This is a long time coming. Tribes have been treated as an afterthought in the United States, but that is changing. Today, Native Americans and Alaska Natives are represented in major decision-making roles, and their water rights are beginning to be treated as legitimate. This demonstrates that Indigenous history and Indigenous sovereignty are becoming incorporated into the national narrative. Thank you.
Well, let's take just a few minutes and have some questions, and please know that we'll have time also at the end of the session for questions that may occur to you throughout the next couple of presentations. Anybody?
In the back?
I can speak loudly if you
Please,
prefer.
okay.
Yeah, that might save you a little time. I'm in the back corner here. So I recently did an Upper Colorado River Basin tour with a member of the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. And can you speak a little bit about what happened with the exchange of water rights and the development of Lake Nighthorse and their inability to still access the water that's in Lake Nighthorse?
Good question. So the question she's asking about Lake Nighthorse, which is built basically on the northern end of the Southern Ute Reservation. Let me go back a couple slides here so you can get oriented to that. So Lake Nighthorse, as you can see, is right here. And it was actually incorporated in that 1988 settlement. Lake Nighthorse was part of those negotiations. So the Southern Ute tribe and the Ute Mountain Ute tribe were both part of that 1988 settlement. I just talked about the Ute Mountain Utes to kind of keep it short. But yes, so in that negotiation, the Southern Utes also gained a right to infrastructure, basically, for their reservation. And really the problem for the Southern Utes was timing. And so Lake Nighthorse, when they began to try to push for that reservoir to be built, environmental interests had basically the interest in building dams had waned, and environmental interests had become so dominant that there was so much opposition to building the dam at all, building the reservoir at all, that basically they settled for Lake Nighthorse Light, it's called, which reduced the amount of infrastructure that was going to be built. So Lake Nighthorse is actually off the side of, so here, oh, where is my pointer? There it is, okay. So here's the Animas River. Lake Nighthorse basically diverts water out of the Animas River and is above the river watershed, so it's an off, I forget what you call that, it's like not an off-channel reservoir. And it was originally supposed to have a actual diversion tunnel into the Southern Ute Reservation, but that was never actually funded in the building of that reservoir. So essentially they built a dam without ever having any way to move that water anywhere. And that's been super problematic for the Southern Utes because they need that water for irrigation, they need it for their domestic uses, and they have no way to access it. So there's been all this advocacy to build that water pipeline to the Southern Utes, but there hasn't been much movement forward as far as I can tell. So hopefully that explains enough. Is there any other questions on that, or is that pretty clear for you?
No, I think that definitely touches on that. My point really was just that they offered up this funding, but the funding did not provide the infrastructure that they actually needed to access their full water right in that exchange.
Exactly, yeah. A question from Teal? Oh, sorry, there was, oh yeah, okay.
I just wanted to add that as of right now, the only way to get water from that reservoir is to release it back into the Animas River. So there's actually no delivery option other than just pumping it back downstream. And when they turn on that pumping plant to pump water from the Animas River to Lake Nighthorse, it uses more power than the entire city of Durango combined, which is crazy. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's, yeah, just adds to the kind of wackiness of the whole setup there, yeah. Other questions?
I have a quick question, if I may. When you described the tribal boundaries that existed pre-colonial times, did those tend to follow watershed boundaries?
Only one of them, I'll show you just in these maps, only one of them sort of did, this one. The rest of them, as you can see, were just big blocks of land. So I don't think there was any clear actual like landscape boundaries that defined them. It was just more what the US kind of blocked out, as far as I can tell, yeah.
Other questions? There will be more, I know. Amorina, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Well, Amorina made an interesting observation early on in that charming picture of, I assume that was you in the field of flowers, right, Amorina?